Hello, it's Silver, and this is Trinity Trigger. So Trinity Trigger is an action RPG that's going for a very classic style, and the way it does things is most similar to some earlier RPGs that were, well, they're pretty famous now. So you're talking about stuff like the Mana series, especially games like Secret of Mana, and also the earlier Ys games. This means you have a pretty heavy focus on dungeon exploration and some simple but still enjoyable combat. The combat is a little bit more of a focus in this game than it is in similar games like that, because it's got a little bit more of a mechanical complexity to it. It's got some customization to it, basically. But you play as Cyan, a character with a familiar name if you're a fan of other Square games, and you also have two party members with you at all times, at least once you progress the story enough to find them. And that means this game is, by the way, playable entirely in co-op if you want. You can play with up to two other people, each one controlling their own character, or if you play solo, you can just use the triggers on a controller to swap between characters at will. And the setup for the game is actually a kind of an interesting one. It's basically a world that is ravaged by war from the gods, and as the gods warred, their fallen brethren lost their weapons, and the weapons descended to the surface of this planet and became enormous dungeons. All of the dungeons in the game that you go into are actually big weapons. And these weapons tend to impose some magical reality on the world around them, so they started to kind of divide up the surface of the planet in various ways and really mess with the environment and the people living on the planet. And the gods, seeing that this wasn't working very well for them, decided to be a little bit more subtle about the whole thing instead of destroying the whole place, and created this system where a warrior representing the forces of order and a warrior representing the forces of chaos would be chosen, and then they would do battle, and whoever won would determine the winner of this big godly battle. However, the catch here is that if one of them dies before the battle, then the battle is postponed, a new warrior is chosen, and the whole thing starts over again. And the way that it works isn't quite as black and white as it sounds, with order being good and chaos being evil. In fact, either one winning is actually quite bad for the planet, because if chaos wins, then nothing will have a permanent form and everything will always be in flux, and the physical shape of everything will be determined by emotion, and it'll just be a really rough place to live. However, if order wins, then all emotion will basically disappear, every day will be the same, and everyone will just be sort of mindless automatons going about their business doing the same thing every single day. And so because of all this, there is a third faction that represents balance, and the people of balance have actually been assassinating the warriors repeatedly over the course of history to prevent this big climactic final battle from happening. So they just keep killing all the warriors so that this can actually come to pass. And as the game starts off, you are the chosen warrior of chaos, and you're trying to figure out what's going on, why the gods seem to want this so badly, and what you can do to stop it, because it's clear this cycle of horrible things is going to just keep happening over and over again, and you would rather find a way to break the cycle. So we're a little bit in like the Final Fantasy X kind of scenario, more or less. And you are tasked with going throughout this world and trying to meet your party members, of course, friends that actually want to help you out in terms of ending this conflict instead of just winning as a force of chaos, and trying to figure out who the warrior of order is and what you can do to sort of change their mind and try to stop this from happening. And there's some other stuff that happens later on that I'm not going to spoil that involves some, your classic JRPG ancient conspiracy kind of stuff. So it's not a super novel story. It's not the kind of story that you've never seen before, but it is an interesting world, and it's executed pretty well. The world itself is pretty large, actually, and it's divided in a pretty classic, like, Japanese action RPG kind of sense, where you've got towns dotted around the place with inns and item shops and stuff in them, and you've also got a whole bunch of intermediate areas, like your fields, your places where battle is done as you're exploring into various areas. You've then also got some occasional side objective kind of areas, your harder to reach places with some unique monsters and some other things of that nature, and then you've got your main dungeons, the Arma themselves, the big godly weapons. Your characters are equipped with something called a trigger, which is basically an adorable plushie that can also transform into a weapon. A living plushie, by the way. And everyone's got a different element, and this element kind of informs all of their various attacks. And this is one thing that's actually kind of interesting to me. They use a very weird color coding for the elements that's really unusual for games like this. Lightning is yellow, which isn't that unusual, although in a lot of JRPGs it's purple, but still yellow isn't too odd. But the other two are a bit more weird. Fire is blue, which is a bit strange, and water is pink. Like hot neon pink at that. And your triggers can transform into 8 different weapon types, and the battle system of the game is based all around switching your various weapon types to hit enemy weaknesses. So you can switch on the fly, just press R1 and you'll bring up a radial of all of the weapon forms that your trigger currently knows. Just choose one right there and you can switch. The only times you can't switch are in mid-combo. Pretty much every other time you can switch as you please. There's no cost or cooldown or anything like that. Every weapon form has a combo of 3 different attacks, and each slot, each of those 3 slots has 2 different attacks that can be in each. So you can actually customize the combos of each weapon form to your liking, which is pretty cool. I like it. There's not a massive amount of variety, but there's enough to keep the combat interesting. So basically every weapon has 6 different attacks that you can choose from, and also the different characters don't always have the same attacks for the same weapon form. So one person's spear may work differently from someone else's spear. They may have a couple of attacks shared, and then they may have a couple that are unique to them. Every weapon type also has a weapon aura, which is a sort of gauge that fills up that you can use to activate a triggerable buff. And these are usually pretty powerful, things like big attack increases to health regeneration to making your synchro gauge deplete more slowly. So what is the synchro gauge? As you're attacking, you'll see a radial blue gauge that empties out, and this is your synchro gauge. It's basically like stamina, but only for weapon usage. You don't expend it by dodging or anything like that. It's only from attacking, and you can actually keep attacking even if the gauge empties out, except you'll do like next to no damage at all, so it's really not worth it. And as long as you're attacking, it won't recharge, so you need to actually stop attacking sometimes and let this gauge fill back up. You also have a sort of special attack in the form of the trigger attacks, which are just sort of big, powerful attacks of some kind that's unique to each weapon. And these are kind of odd in that they don't have like a gauge or anything. Instead, your weapon just starts to glow to let you know that you can use it. And there seems to be about like a 2-minute period or so in between uses. It's not displayed anywhere, so it's kind of hard to tell. But yeah, basically you just wait for your weapon to glow again with that character's element, and then you can use that trigger attack whenever you want. These are often best used as like combo enders or initiators into combat with large groups of enemies because they tend to hit very wide-ranging areas. You also have a different gauge on the bottom right of the screen there, which is a sort of Trinity attack gauge. This takes a while to fill up, but once it's full, you can hold the attack button down to perform a huge sort of screen-clearing bomb kind of attack. That's usually really good for either dealing with large groups of tough enemies or attacking when a boss is vulnerable to do a good chunk of damage all at once. The color of the damage numbers is actually really important because white damage numbers simply means you're hitting neutral. You know, the enemy is not resistant or weak to that. But if you start seeing blue damage numbers, that's a bad thing. You want to avoid that because that means the enemy is resistant to that weapon and it'll do like 1/10 of the damage that it normally would, so it's almost useless to use against them. However, if they're big sort of pinkish reddish numbers, that means they're weak to that weapon type, and that's sort of what you're encouraged to do, is switch weapon types around all the time to know which enemies are weak to which weapons. This is especially important in boss fights, and hopefully a boss will actually have these question marks under their health gauge to show you how many weapons they're weak against, and once you find one of the weapons that they are weak against, it'll show up there to let you know you found it. In terms of progression, you have classic levels, of course. Defeat enemies, gain experience, get levels. It all works exactly how you would think for an action RPG, but you've also got manatite, which are for weapons and for armors, although the interesting thing is you don't actually equip armors in this game. It's just that each weapon form is considered having its own armor, so basically you will end up with up to 3 different slots for your weapon and for your armor, so 6 slots total for each weapon form that you can fill with these manatites. There's socketable gems that increase all sorts of various statistics. There are tons and tons of them to find. You can also craft them, and they can have different rarities as well that will have extra sort of benefits if you equip them. And you're encouraged to sort of tailor a build of manatites for each weapon and armor combo for every form that you want to use to make them more powerful. You can also craft consumables. By the way, there's quite a few consumables in the game of various different kinds, and you have a nice sort of quick use radial for all your consumable items as well. You can buy consumables of various kinds and also, of course, buy recipes, but crafting is sort of the way to go because it's far, far cheaper, although it doesn't take too long in this game to sort of break the economy, which is kind of a common problem with RPGs like these, where you start to make a ton of money because of the amount of combat that's in the game, so after a short time, money is no object. As you're exploring around, you will come across various other side things, like more difficult enemies that will spawn in these areas with a warning sign that says, "Hey, doofus, don't go here yet because everything here is really hard." And if you ignore the sign and continue on, you'll find some sort of elite monster that drops some special stuff that's really, really, really far in advance of all the other monsters in that area, so you definitely won't be able to kill it when you first get there. And in terms of the boss fights, you actually don't do damage to their health gauge at all at first. They have a sort of break gauge beneath their health gauge. This is what's depleted the most when you're using weapons that they're weak to. So this is why you want to find their weakness as soon as possible. And you have to completely deplete this gauge in order to sort of stun them. And then while they're stunned, their health gauge will be vulnerable, and then they'll recharge it and you'll have to do it again. So this means that the boss fights in this game actually tend to last a fair amount of time because you can't directly damage their health gauge until you deplete this recharging break gauge first. So it does mean that bosses have a sort of rotation of several different moves they'll use, and sometimes multiple phases over the course of their main boss fight, which will be a longer fight than any of the other combats in the game. The boss fights are more involved for sure. Also important to the genre, of course, is dungeon design, since you're going to be dungeon delving a lot, and in this game the dungeons are where you go to get new weapon forms, and you have to find the properly colored altar for each character's element to actually allow them to utilize the new weapon form. So you gotta go through multiple floors to find multiple altars to power everyone up. So you'll be exploring lots of dungeons in this game, and they're pretty good. They tend to have a somewhat teleporter heavy layout where there's a lot of teleportation between floors going on. This only really starts to happen in like the latter half of the game. The earlier half is mostly staircases to many floors of dungeon, but eventually when the layouts get more complicated, you start dealing with a lot of teleporters and things. There's often a bunch of optional treasures to find and a large, very large number of enemies to go through, and of course crowning them all off with boss fights. The interesting thing about the dungeons in this game, besides the just the general layouts, is the fact that you often have to go to each one multiple times. The story doesn't necessarily make you do this for like the main story progression, but you will often want to because the dungeons tend to have multiple sections. You'll only actually be able to do the first sort of section up to the first boss the first time you visit that dungeon, which may be the only time you visit it for story reasons, but there's more to the dungeons than that you can go back and do later. As you complete these dungeons, by the way, your triggers will also gain in power, not just in the obvious ways of learning new weapon forms, but also a couple of other ways. They'll gain more manatite slots so that you can equip more of those passive gems. They'll also gain the ability to level themselves up with this resource, these points that you get for killing enemies. You can spend on improving the power of your combos. So every single one of the 6 combo attacks for every weapon type has several different levels that they can go through to improve their power, and you spend these points on those to improve your favorite combos. And then at like roughly halfway through the game-ish, maybe a little farther than that, you will pass this story threshold where something important happens, no spoilers, and your triggers are all upgraded drastically. Their appearance actually physically changes. All of the appearances of all of your weapons change as well, and they all gain entirely new trigger attacks, those big, powerful sort of screen-affecting cooldown-based attacks that everyone can do. So yeah, all 8 of your trigger attacks will actually be replaced with more powerful versions that are oftentimes quite a lot different than the ones that came before. So you do get some a good feeling of like you're getting more powerful on your journey, right? It's not just about gaining levels. You also have various other thresholds that you'll cross that make a big difference in terms of your overall combat performance. Let's see, the only other things to talk about I suppose would be the voice acting, which is quite good. You will recognize all of the voice actors basically if you've ever seen like any English dubbed anime ever or played like any English dubbed JRPG. They are very common voice actors, but that's for a good reason because they're very good at what they do. They give a good performance in this game that's pretty endearing and a little bit like Bravely Default-ish in terms of how the characters feel, which, you know, it's kind of like a little bit kid-friendly, but not super kid-friendly, if you get what I mean. And the other thing would be the music. The music is quite nice. The overall exploration music is nothing necessarily to write home about. It's fine, it's not bad, it's just kind of background music. But the dungeon and boss fight music in some other towns and stuff, they have some really nice tracks to them. A lot of interesting and memorable tracks in some of the later towns and stuff. So yeah, the music is definitely a good point in the game's favor. So overall, my view on Trinity Trigger is that it's quite good. It is a solid action RPG that's being made in an obviously classic style, right? It's trying very clearly to evoke the memory of your Secrets of Mana and your Ys 6s and all those sorts of games. And it does a pretty good job. It's solid enough as a relatively compact kind of casual action RPG, right? Just don't go into it expecting like immense challenge or crazy high combat complexity or anything like that. It is a much more casual experience, but it also has enough substance to actually see you through it without it getting overly repetitive. So, as always, I will link you in the description below this video to the Steam store page to this game so that you can check it out yourself if you'd like. Thank you guys very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.